In this video, we introduce the Gospel of Matthew the same way that we introduce many other New Testament texts in this class, namely by means of a top five. The top five most important things that I think you need to know about the Gospel of Matthew. But before we jump into our top five, I want to return us to our course thesis and tell us sort of explicitly what we're doing as to the argument of this entire course. So the argument of this course, or is essentially a definition of what the New Testament is, that we are unpacking this definition of the New Testament as the course progresses. So we talk about the New Testament as a collection of different kinds of texts from different genres that exhibit the different ways that Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection are significant for the authors and audiences of these texts. And we've been spending some weeks sort of in preparation to getting to these texts by talking about the historical, cultural, and religious context in which these texts were written. These contexts are still going to sort of make their way into our discussion of these texts, but we have started to move to actually engaging the texts themselves. So as to our course thesis in this video, we're dealing with a particular text, namely the Gospel of Matthew, and we're looking at the way that Jesus is significant for Matthew in different kinds of ways. And we're also looking at the circumstances that went in or stood behind the Gospel of Matthew's composition. So what can we glean? What information can we know about the author of Matthew, the audience of Matthew, and the Gospel itself on the basis of the narrative of the Gospel of Matthew? So here we start with number 5. Matthew identifies Jesus with significant figures in Jewish history, more so than the other canonical Gospels do. And I'm going to introduce us to one way that Matthew does this, give us just one example here. And we're going to do so by way of Psalm 46 from the King James Version. So you see here your image, as you probably well know, this is Mr. Billy Shakespeare. And we're going to get at this here, what Psalm 46 has to do with Shakespeare, has to do with the Gospel of Matthew, by a quick lecture pause. You're not even going to fill anything out in the course notes, but just doing some math. What is 1611 minus 1565? The answer is 46. 1611 is the year that the King James Version was presented. 1565 is the year that Mr. William Shakespeare was born. And so at the time that the King James Version was presented, William Shakespeare was 46 years old. And there are some rumors that William Shakespeare had some hand to play in the translation of the King James Version. So for all of the King James Version's shortcomings, it is absolutely beautiful and poetic prose. And in some cases, it appears that Shakespeare actually did have a hand in doing this translation. But what's really interesting is that Shakespeare appears to have provided us an Easter egg into the King James Version in Psalm 46, wherein he refers to himself. So what I want you to do here is pause the video and count 46 words in from the start of the psalm and see what words you find, and then count 46 words in from the end of the psalm and see what words you find. And of course, we're going to have shake and spear be our two words here. So this is our supposed Easter egg of William Shakespeare using something numerically to indicate himself in the psalm, in Psalm 46, when he was 46 years old, writes himself into the King James Version of the Bible, and so gets some sunglasses here. And the reason that I show you this, and the reason that I ask you to engage in this, is not only because it's, a nice little interesting Easter egg about the King James Version, but Matthew does, similar kinds of things. Matthew is concerned with numbers a lot in his gospel. He patterns his gospel in 3s and 7s and does some really interesting things numerically. And this starts at the very beginning of the gospel. So in Matthew's genealogy, remember Matthew begins with the human genealogy of Jesus, and so is depicted as Ezekiel's one like a human. So if I were to ask you to pause here and count all of the generations in each one of these paragraphs, you would find, as you may already know, that the number adds up to 14. And Matthew is clear about this himself. He tells us that the generations from Abraham to David is 14, and then from David to the exile is 14, and then from the exile to Jesus is 14. And so not only is David mentioned twice in here by name, but also this number 14 appears to be another reference to King David by what is called gematria. So in the ancient world, in a variety of languages, numbers are much more closely associated with letters, or I should say letters are much more closely associated with numbers. You think of even Roman numerals, where the numeral is assigned to a letter. So this is the case in Hebrew as well, and we have examples of gematria in Revelation, the number 666. We'll talk about this towards the end of the course, what's going on there, but it has to do with this thing of letters being assigned to numbers. And so David's name adds up to 14 in the Hebrew alphabet. That is to say, David's number would be 14 on the basis of the letters of his name. So we have in Hebrew moving from right to left. So if Aleph is our first letter in Hebrew, Dalet, the first letter of Dawid, is going to be this D here. It's going to be associated with the number 4. The second letter of David's 3-letter name in Hebrew is the letter Vav, which is equated to the number 6. And then the third letter is again a dalet. So we have 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. So Matthew has really sort of hammered home the connection to King David, not only by the way that the genealogy is structured, but also by including this number 14 here as sort of the prominent number in the genealogy. So Matthew himself, like Shakespeare, gets our sunglasses. Number 4 here. The Gospel of Matthew was likely written in the mid-80s CE, perhaps in a prosperous urban setting such as Antioch. And so I use these tentative words, likely and perhaps, because we really don't have a way of knowing these things. But there seem to be some hints in the Gospel to suggest this date and this kind of setting. So as to our date, perhaps around 85, between 80 and 90 CE. We know that the Gospel of Matthew is written after Mark because it makes extensive use of Mark. And so some scholars will say, well, Mark needs some opportunity to sort of get out there. That text maybe took a little bit longer to be circulated in the ancient world than they did today. So we give Matthew some time after Mark, and also after the Roman destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. In both Matthew and Luke's sort of version of Mark 13, the destruction of the temple seems to be much more certain. And then Matthew has this bit in chapter 27 where he says, even today, referring to the blood money that the chief priests used to buy a certain field. That the name of this field is even today here, which it's supposed that this sort of indicates a longer passing of time. As to who our author is, we'll talk about sort of maybe some features of this author's identity in just a moment here, but the Gospel of Matthew is technically anonymous, just as is Mark, Luke, and John. We don't have any naming of an author in the Gospel itself, but we can seem to determine that this author knows Jewish scripture very well and quotes it about twice as often as Mark and Luke do. As to our location, we said perhaps some kind of prosperous urban setting. Antioch is often proposed by scholars because of the Christian community that sort of developed there in the decades coming after the Gospel of Matthew was written. And the reasons that people say that we have a prosperous urban setting is, one, Matthew changes the Marcane word village, that Jesus is often going in and out of villages to cities. And the idea is that this reflects Matthew's own sort of knowledge of and trafficking in the world. That Matthew doesn't live in a city or in a village, Matthew lives in a city. And so he sort of naturally just changes the villages to cities from the Gospel of Mark. And then the bit about it being a prosperous setting, and perhaps Matthew writing to a group that is more prosperous, or writing for readers who are more prosperous in the Gospel of Mark, is that Matthew will change Jesus' command to the disciples in Mark 6:8 to not take any copper coins with them, to not take any copper, silver, or gold coins with them. So presuming that the disciples have some more money, and that this command is, to the disciples, but also by extension to the audience or to the readers of the gospel. So by indicating more kinds of money, the suggestion is then that the audience and the setting is a more prosperous one for the Gospel of Matthew. So if we're going to look at this on a map, and we'll do this somewhat regularly in our video lectures here, taking a look at the spread of Christianity. So we have in this little box Palestine, Galilee, and Jerusalem, where Jesus is going to be trafficking, that Jesus's ministry is rural and it's in Palestine. With the writing of Matthew, if it is in a place like Antioch, we have the sort of Christian movement, the early Christian movement, or the Jesus movement, starting to spread out geographically. Number 3 in our top 5 on Matthew is that Matthew is what we might call a Jewish Christian. And I put this in scare quotes for a reason. And it has to do with sort of what we think about Judaism and Christianity in this time. But as far as the sort of Jewish part of Jewish Christian, as we noted already, Matthew knows and quotes scripture well, more often than does Mark and Luke. And then in Matthew 10, Jesus tells the 12, instructs them not to go into Gentile territory and not to go into Samaritan towns, but to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. There's this real focus on Israel and Jews in the Gospel of Matthew, more strongly than there is in Mark and in Luke. And then we've also already talked about Matthew identifying Jesus with these Israelite or Jewish heroes of old, with King David. Matthew also has Jesus going in and out of Egypt at the very beginning of his life, just as Moses goes in and out of Egypt at the beginning of his ministry. We have these connections with these Jewish heroes that really sort of up the ante of who Jesus is in the Gospel of Matthew. But then, so I noted that we have Jewish Christian in scare quotes, and this is because we're not making a kind of clean distinction between Jewish and Christian. So the idea when we say Jewish Christian is that Matthew seems to be very steeped in Judaism. That is, he is probably not a Gentile convert to the Jesus movement, probably raised as an ethnic Jew. And as a reminder, when we talk about Judaism in this setting, we're talking about a very diverse identity. That Judaism is not one thing in the ancient world, but rather can sort of be characterized as a set of beliefs that sort of outline what counts as Judaism. We call these the non-negotiable beliefs of monotheism, covenant of Torah, and then within this sphere, there's a variety of negotiable Jewish beliefs on any number of topics, just as in Christianity today, there would be a diversity of theological positions on any topic. And so here you can see I put the Jesus movement and Matthew's image from the book of Kells into our circle of Judaism, so that Matthew's still within Judaism, kind of steeped in Judaism, and is a Christian movement that reflects sort of the diversity of Judaism in the first century world. Number 2, the Gospel of Matthew exhibits a unique and intensified hostility towards Jewish leaderships. And this is part and parcel with number 3, Matthew being a Jewish Christian. That we shouldn't think of Matthew as sort of on the outside, showing hostility towards Jews who are on the inside, but Matthew is within that sphere, and the hostility is intra-Jewish rather than an outsider critiquing something from an outsider's perspective. And so we'll see in the Gospel of Matthew, in contrast to Luke, that Jesus will call, or John the Baptist, will call the Pharisees and the Sadducees, some of the Jewish authorities, a brood of vipers, evil, or children of hell, and even will identify Jewish leaders with Satan in the Gospel of Matthew. So he uses very long, tacks on very strong language to different Jewish authority groups in the Gospel of Matthew. And this reflects Matthew's sort of intra-Jewish conflict. Again, it's not Matthew criticizing from the outside, but Matthew criticizing from within. We've talked about previously in this class, sometimes the people that we have most bitter rivalries or hostilities towards are the people whom we are closest with ideologically or religiously. And so it seems that rather than being the critique of an outsider, that Matthew is sort of having this intra-Jewish conflict. And this is all very, very important because the Gospel of Matthew in particular, more so than the other Gospels, with maybe the exception of John, John's up there too, has been used for very anti-Semitic ends. That people have read the Gospel of Matthew assuming that it's Christian literature opposed to Judaism as a whole and used it for horrific ends. And that has to be disavowed in very, very strong terms. And when we sort of think of Matthew as an intra-Jewish conflict, it really changes the way that we think about applying some of these negative things that Matthew has to say about Jewish leadership in the gospel. And then number one here, slightly cut off by the video. I apologize for that. Matthew extensively uses literary material from Mark and improves upon it stylistically. So Matthew is, of course, one of our synoptic gospels, and 90% of Mark appears in Matthew. So Matthew sort of copies over and edits Markane material at a very, very high rate, a higher rate than Luke. In Luke, this is about 50 to 55%. That is 50 to 55% of Mark is in Luke. So Matthew is also going to add to Mark, give us additional material, but also, and notably, as Luke will also do, Matthew is going to improve Mark's style. So those things that we've talked about previously in the Gospel of Mark as sort of characteristic of spoken narrative, things like the historic present. He goes and he says, these are things that we would, the way we would speak when telling a story orally versus writing. We talk differently than we write. And those things that sort of smack of the spoken word in Mark get changed to more literary norms in Matthew and Luke. So this sense of urgency in the Gospel of Mark, that word immediately repeated over and over and over and over again in the Gospel of Mark, is changed in Matthew. And Matthew and Luke also show sort of more precision when it comes to the way that they evoke scripture and other texts and embed it into their own gospels. And the same is true with sort of the historical accuracies. That Matthew and Luke are much more precise and sort of improve upon Mark in with respect to their precision. And the point of all this is that Matthew is using Mark and sort of modulating it for a different way of reading. If we've argued that Mark works well as a spoken narrative or as a performance, then I gave you the option of taking a look at Dr. Phil Rugi Jones's performance of the Gospel of Mark. Matthew doesn't read the same way. Sitting down and reading Matthew in one sitting doesn't work quite as well, but it does work well in chunks, and particularly in chunks for reading and study in churches or in synagogues in the first century world. So it appears that Matthew is changing Mark to be a different kind of text used for a different purpose by literarily improving upon it. And so what I want to do to end our video here is to have you do sort of your own wrap up on the Gospel of Matthew based on what you have seen and experienced here in this video. And if you have already read the textbook for this week, and also including any of your prior knowledge of the Gospel of Matthew, what I want you to do is take 5 minutes, you can set a timer or not, and do what I call a data dump on the Gospel of Matthew. Take all the things that have just been put into your brain, and by getting them out of your brain, they're going to stay in there better. So one of the sort of neurological tendencies is the more often we communicate what we know, the better we know it. So what I want you to do is take 5 minutes, and in whatever form works for you. This could be a free write by typing. It could be creating a concept map where you write down a concept and draw a line to another concept that relates to it, and you sort of free associate that way. Or you could do something else. But whatever you do, I want you to take 5 minutes and sort of just dump the information that you've been engaging with Matthew in this video and in the material for this week onto a page, whether physical or electronic, in some format.